Welcome back to our journey into the forgotten corners of history. Today, we're not standing on land, we're bobbing on violent waves at the mouth of Manila Bay, Philippines. In the hazy salt mist of early morning, a strange presence is slowly emerging from the horizon. From afar, it doesn't look like a natural island, nor exactly like a ship. It is a gray, boxy, cold mass, a ghost of steel and concrete that has stood here isolated for more than a century. Local fishermen often steer clear of this place when night falls. They call it the island that never sleeps, where the echoes of the past are still imprisoned within walls meters thick. Welcome to Fort Drum, an arrogant engineering marvel and also one of the most haunting tombs the US military ever built. Before we step onto that rusted steel deck, let me tell you why this place was called the unsinkable Concrete Battleship. In the early years of the 20th century, with the ambition to turn Manila into an impregnable fortress, the Americans did something that was considered insane at the time. They didn't just build a base, they performed a brutal geological surgery on a coral rock island named Fraile. Engineers used explosives and sheer labor to level the entire top of the island, carving it down until it became a flat platform barely above the waterline. On that pitiful rock foundation, they poured thousands of tons of reinforced concrete to create a structure shaped like a dreadnought battleship. With a length of more than 100 meters and walls up to 6 meters thick, it was designed to withstand the most terrifying bombs and shells of that era. It has no engine, no sails. It stands there towering, defying the ocean like a silent monster waiting for prey. As our boat draws closer, the first feeling that overwhelms me is a breath-stealing smallness. Those massive 14-inch gun barrels are still aimed straight at the sea. Even though the paint has peeled and the salt has eaten into them for decades, they still carry a strange sense of menace. There is something deeply unnatural about this place. A rigid, artificial structure lying amid the softness and vastness of the ocean. Looking through the camera lens, I feel like I'm staring at the skeleton of a gigantic prehistoric creature fossilized right in the middle of battle. The silence here isn't peaceful. It's a pressure-filled silence like the air before a major storm. Can you see the pitch-black gaps on the fortress's body? Those are ventilation shafts. Places where decades ago hot air and the breath of hundreds of people once circulated, and also where the most horrific tragedy in its history began. The value we seek on this trip isn't just dry technical specifications or outdated military triumphs. We're here to understand the limits of human beings when faced with absolute isolation and the betrayal of the very structure meant to protect them. Fort Drum is proof of a profound lesson. When people try to build something so strong to keep the enemy outside, they unknowingly create the perfect cage to imprison themselves within. Entering this fortress isn't just an archaeological expedition, it's a journey deep into the psychology of fear. Every crack in the concrete, every patch of rust on the gun turrets is trying to tell a story of arrogance and its cost. Now, check your flashlights and your recording equipment. We will climb up, we will step into the belly of this beast to hear what the ghosts of history are trying to whisper. Prepare yourselves, because the darkness inside Fort Drum is unlike any darkness you've ever experienced. The sound of my shoes striking the concrete floor of Fort Drum rings out dry and misplaced against the vast open space of Manila Bay. As I step over the threshold of a gigantic steel door warped by horrific explosions, in the past, the cool sea breeze behind my back abruptly disappears. In its place comes a thick, heavy air carrying the smell of rot rust and a hint of dampness from concrete that hasn't seen sunlight in a long time. This is the moment we officially leave the present world and step into an entity frozen in time. My flashlight begins to sweep across long, yawning corridors where darkness isn't simply the absence of light. It's so dense you feel as if you have to swim through it to move forward. The deeper we go, the more clearly the structure of this concrete ship reveals itself. The brutality in its design. As you can see, unlike a normal building, there are no windows here. Every square centimeter around us is dense reinforced concrete. The Americans built this place for a single purpose, to turn it into an impenetrable fortress, but standing here it feels more like a voluntary prison. The narrow, low hallway system makes human breath feel heavier. The military gray paint is peeling off in large sheets like the skin of a monster decomposing. The silence here is so terrifying you can hear your own heartbeat and the blood rushing in your ears. It's a strange kind of auditory pressure that only spaces buried beneath meters of thick concrete can create. The core value I want you to feel in this act is the concept of physical isolation. Imagine in 1942, more than 200 people having to live in this space under the bombing rain of the Japanese military. They couldn't see the sky, couldn't know whether it was day or night except by looking at the wall clocks. Fort Drum was no longer a military pride. It became a minimal, dark box where every human survival instinct was compressed tight. Those engineers calculated every detail so the fortress could stand firm against heavy warheads, but perhaps they forgot to calculate the psychological impact when human beings are stripped of their connection to the natural world. Every step we take deeper into the belly of this whale is one step closer to understanding the ultimate fear of being trapped. Look ahead. The passage leads down to lower basement levels where the generators and ammunition storage were located. The steel steps are so rusted, they look like they could collapse at any moment if we aren't careful. My flashlight beam can only cut a few meters before the darkness completely swallows it. There is a chilling fact few people notice inside Fort Drum. The temperature is always a few degrees higher than outside due to the heat retention of the concrete, creating a hot, stifling feeling as if the fortress is still smoldering after an explosion from 8 decades ago. We are moving toward the heart of the obsession, where archaeological artifacts no longer lie on the ground. They seem to hover in the air, waiting for someone to come and awaken horrific memories. We are standing in the area that once served as the living center of more than 200 people, known as a small town inside stone. My flashlight sweeps across empty rooms where steel bunk beds are now nothing but twisted, rusted skeleton frames. Here, amid thick dust and flaking concrete, we begin to find fragments of life. A broken-toothed plastic comb in a dark corner, a rotted leather shoe sole, and stacks of rust-stained canned food tins. These aren't just historical trash, they are evidence of an existence that was resilient and also profoundly tragic. Look closely at those gray walls. There are still lines hastily carved with a sharp object, recording names, dates, and even vague messages. That was how the soldiers tried to leave their mark, an assertion that they once existed in this cold, concrete belly before being swallowed by history. Moving into the next room, we see traces of a bakery and a small cinema. It's hard to imagine the aroma of fresh bread once existed in a place that doesn't have a single breath of natural air. The Americans tried to maintain the most normal life possible to keep the soldiers from going insane. The cinema here wasn't merely for entertainment. It was a psychological dose, an effort to connect people who were being buried alive to images of a free world outside. Yet the true value we discover here is a ruthless contrast. While glittering images played on the screen, just outside those 6-meter-thick walls were the deafening blasts of artillery and the shriek of shells trying to rip the island apart. The contrast between the desire for peace and the reality of destructive war creates a heavy atmosphere that makes anyone who enters shiver. The names Wilson Battery and Marshall Battery are mentioned in military documents with pride, but here we find relics that tell another story. It is the story of sleepless nights under the constant roar of generators, of hurried meals mixed with concrete dust raining from the ceiling whenever shells struck. A shard of white porcelain plate lying isolated amid rubble recalls efforts to preserve human dignity in an inhuman environment. The soldiers at Fort Drum didn't only fight the Japanese enemy, they also fought their own terrifying silence, the feeling of being forgotten by the world out at sea. These relics are the quietest yet most powerful voices. They shatter the stillness of the present to return us to forced laughter, sighs, and the silent prayers of soldiers long ago. The archaeological value here isn't in the big guns, it's in the scratches on steel tables, where soldiers once played cards to kill time, or oil stains on the floor, where they maintained machinery in desperation. Fort Drum teaches us that no matter how strong a structure is, the most fragile element is always the human being. These small objects are the only remaining thread between us and the departed souls. They remind us that behind every military triumph are thousands of hours of endured pain and loneliness. As we continue deeper into these dark corridors, let those relics guide the way, because they are the only witnesses truly left who understand the cost of surviving inside an eternal battleship hollowed out in spirit. I'm lowering my body to slip through a narrow gap leading down to the fortress's lowest basement, where the ammunition stores and the massive generator system were placed. At this depth, the sound of waves outside has completely vanished, replaced by an absolute silence. So uncomfortable, it hurts. My flashlight begins to flicker. Weak beams dance on stained concrete walls. Listen, that isn't the wind. It's compressed air hissing through rusted ventilation pipes, creating a mournful droning chain of sound like extended crying. In the urban exploration world, we call this the ghost climax point, where the presence of the past becomes so dense you feel as if hundreds of eyes are watching you from those sweltering dark corners. When I sweep my light up to the ceiling, thick black soot patches appear dense and haunting. This isn't smoke from ordinary battles, but the trace of 1,000-degree heat from a gasoline and diesel mixture that incinerated everything in 1945. Down in this basement, suffocation is no longer psychological, it's a physical pressure you can feel. Engineers designed this ventilation system to bring life, but in the final hours it became conduits of death. Anyone standing here can feel a sudden shift in temperature. There are unexpected cold drafts brushing past even though we are deep inside a heat-retaining concrete mass. It's a physical phenomenon, not clearly explained, but it sends chills down my spine when I think of the hundreds of people driven into a corner right where I'm standing now. There is a chilling truth I want to share with you in this ammunition storage room. Our recording devices often pick up strange bands of audio frequencies like footsteps, pounding on steel floors, or distant metal impacts. The ghosts at Fort Drum aren't cinematic entities, they are imprisoned echoes. These 6-meter thick walls don't only block artillery, they also keep horrific memories from escaping. The Japanese soldiers ultimately chose death in this darkness rather than surrender, and it seems their resentment seeped into every particle of concrete. When I place my hand on the smoke-stained wall, it feels as if vibrations from the old blast are still smoldering. A kind of negative energy makes you want to leave immediately. The deepest value this act brings is the realization of the perfect trap. We often admire fortresses for their strength, but at the deepest level, strength becomes the enemy. When my flashlight sweeps across an emergency exit welded shut with thick steel, I recognize the desperation of the soldiers long ago. No retreat, no light, only heat and darkness. Fort Drum fulfilled its mission of never being sunk, but it failed to protect the souls of those inside. This is where military history becomes a horror story of existence. Hold tight to your gear, because we are standing on the thin boundary between reality and the aftershocks of a tragedy that has never truly ended. I am standing at the very center of destruction, where concrete walls were heated, melted, and deformed into grotesque shapes. Let your mind rewind to one day in April of 1945, when the sky over Manila Bay shook with the return of the US military. But this time they did not bring ordinary bombardment. To deal with the Japanese garrison entrenched in these impenetrable underground chambers, the Americans made the most brutally engineered decision in the history of war. They poured thousands of gallons of a gasoline and diesel mixture into the ventilation shafts we just passed. Imagine thousands of blocks of deadly liquid flooding the corridors, seeping down every stair, soaking into every corner of this room, where soldiers were huddled in the dark with their final hope, in the protection of 6-meter thick walls. The moment a grenade was thrown in to ignite it, Fort Drum was no longer a fortress. It became a gigantic thermobaric bomb. The horrific blast hurled steel doors weighing tons into the sky like scraps of paper. But the real tragedy was inside. The extremely thick, reinforced concrete designed to block every impact from the outside now betrayed the people within. By trapping all that immense heat, the internal temperature soared to thousands of degrees, turning corridors into fire ducts and rooms into blazing ovens. No oxygen to breathe, only toxic smoke and scorching heat rising from inside the lungs. The soldiers had nowhere to run, no way to escape, because the solid structure they trusted had become an unbreakable tomb. The value we must face in this act is the cruel irony of absolute safety. In war, sometimes what protects you best is exactly what kills you, in the most agonizing way. In those hours, Fort Drum became a living inferno on Earth. The heat was so intense it altered the molecular structure of the concrete, making the wall sections I'm touching here brittle and ash gray with death. Can you feel the absolute desperation that once flooded this space? It was screams extinguished by pressure, panic, and fiery darkness when people realized they were being burned alive by the very strength of their shelter. This is a costly lesson in human arrogance, trying to control forces far beyond our ability to contain. That heat didn't last for just a few hours. According to historical records, the fortress smoldered and radiated heat for many consecutive days afterward. The Americans could not step inside for a full week because the temperature was still too high. When they finally entered, they found only heaps of ash and traces of a massacre they themselves had created. Standing here now in this deadly stillness, I still feel as if a hot current is rising from the floor. The souls lost here didn't die from shells. They died from being trapped inside an engineering wonder that turned into a perfect instrument of torture. This is the most dramatic act and also the harshest warning about the nature of violence. It makes no distinction between fortress and prison once the fire of destruction begins to blaze. I step out of the smoke-dark basement and pause in the main corridor, where weak sunlight pours down through blast holes above, forming columns of tiny dust dancing in the air. After passing through memories of fire and blood, the stillness of Fort Drum now doesn't feel peaceful. It is a heavy silence, as if this space is trying to compress every sound into layers of reinforced concrete. Here, time no longer seems to move in the usual way. Everything is motionless from rusted steel to cracked wall slabs, creating a perfect suspension. Have you ever wondered why a place that once held intense life, iron discipline, and even heart-ripping screams could now become so mute? This silence is history's final answer to humanity's greatest military ambitions. When I stand still and switch off every light-emitting device, darkness covers me like a burial shroud. In that absolute solitude, I recognize the true value of this archaeological journey. Fort Drum isn't just a military structure, it is a mirror reflecting the nature of existence. We spend our whole lives building walls, whether of concrete or of emotion, hoping to protect ourselves from threats outside. But in the end, it is the silence inside those walls that erodes us. This fortress stood firm against thousands of shells, yet it collapsed under isolation. The terrifying silence we're feeling is the aftershock of a harsh truth matter can endure forever, but the human soul and human warmth are incredibly fragile. Every second standing here, I feel as if I'm communicating with endless emptiness, where memories are no longer called by name. Look at those massive 14-inch gun barrels quietly staring out toward the horizon. They are no longer weapons of destruction. They are like the final notes of a heroic anthem cut short. The silence surrounding them feels solemn and bitter. The people who once operated these machines have passed into eternity, leaving behind a soulless structure that nature is slowly reclaiming. The practical value I want to send to you is reflection on the meaning of protection. Is it worth it to trade connection and freedom for absolute safety, cold as concrete? Fort Drum teaches us that silence is the loudest scream of things forgotten, and if we do not listen to it, we will continue building tombs for ourselves in the name of protection. Before leaving this dark underground area to return to the surface, I stop once more to listen. There is a strange sound, maybe just water droplets falling from the ceiling or distant waves hitting the island's base, but in this space it echoes like a warning bell. This fortress will never disappear. It will keep standing as a reminder of what humans can do and what they can be forced to endure. This terrifying silence is the thread linking a glorious past to a desolate present. It compels us to face ourselves, our most hidden fears of loneliness. Fort Drum completed its role as an unsinkable battleship, but now it is carrying out a nobler mission, becoming a museum of silence where every brick and every patch of rust holds a profound educational value about peace and the value of life. I slowly step out of the darkness of the final corridor, and immediately, the glaring tropical sunlight and a salty sea wind slam into my chest. The feeling of breathing free air after hours beneath Fort Drum's thick concrete is hard to put into words. As I look back at the fortress from the boat deck drifting away, that gray concrete mass once again becomes small amid the vast ocean, but in my mind, it is no longer an inanimate object. This journey has shown us that behind numbers about wall thickness or gun barrel size are stories of sacrifice, fear, and an eternal lesson about freedom. Fort Drum stands there as a reminder that the strongest protection doesn't lie in reinforced concrete walls, but in human connection and a shared understanding of the value of peace. I hope that through the lens of today's expedition, you've gained a deeper, more different perspective on this strange concrete battleship. The world around us is still filled with forgotten fortresses, places where history isn't only written on paper, but also soaked into every stone and every shard of rust. Learning about them isn't only to satisfy curiosity, it's also to help us appreciate what we have in the present. Never let yourself be trapped behind walls of indifference or fear, because the cost of isolation is always greater than any protection it claims to offer. Let the echoes of the past guide us to build a future where fortresses like Fort Drum exist only as museums for reflection, and never again have to receive another soul imprisoned in darkness and gunfire one more time. If you feel that this footage and these eerie archaeological stories have brought you new value, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journeys. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep venturing into abandoned lands, places where time has stopped to tell you secrets that have never been revealed. Leave a comment below with your feelings or share if you have any additional information about the mysteries of Manila Bay. Every subscription is a brick that helps us build an ever stronger community of people who love history and exploration. This Fort Drum expedition comes to a close here. Thank you for accompanying me from the very first minutes to the very last second. Out there, the world still holds many mysteries waiting for us to decode, and I will be back soon with stories even more haunting and more fascinating. Wishing you a good day, and always keep your flame of curiosity and your hunger to uncover hidden truths. And now goodbye, and see you again on the journeys ahead. We will meet again in the places where darkness begins to tell its stories.